and Sean's going to speak to that. So we'll be much more clear about what is happening in our own town today after we hear Sean and John. John and Sean. So anyhow, Sean, I'll turn it over to you to talk about your aspect of the program, and you can turn it over to me.
Sounds good. Thank you all for inviting me here today. It's, you guys, Reading Nursery celebrated its 50th year in business last year, and we are so appreciative of the support of the Reading Garden Club. You guys are amazing, and we really appreciate it. It's a tough retail market out there for, whether you're in a mall or you're a little garden center. Young's Garden down in Wilton went out of business, a bunch of the ones down in Westport. So we feel very blessed to be here in Reading, where people appreciate gardens, are out there gardening and supporting our little nursery. So we really appreciate that. And the other thing I wanted to talk, well, first of all, before I go to my plan thing, just picking up on the pollinator pathways, which John McLaren and I are involved in through my work with the Reading Lanterns. I think it's a very important program. Supporting it is wonderful. And just a little bit about Reading Nursery and our pesticides. We do not put in neonicotinoids into our plant material before, so when you buy our annuals and perennials, you know that they have not been pre-treated. I am not opposed to using pesticides, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that when it comes to treating things. But my philosophy is kind of like, it's like medicine too. When you're sick or your plants are sick, you want to treat them to make them better. But as with medication, you want to do the minimum amount to do the job. You don't want to be taking medication just to take it, And same thing with pesticides. You do not want to just be doing it. You should be treating specific things or doing things that are very minimal impact in order to protect things. So I'm going to talk about some things, but people call me all the time, especially, ticks are a huge concern around here. And people say, do you use organic or do you use all natural? And people often conflate organic and all natural with safe or non-toxic. And those terms do not equal. You can have something that is organic, like arsenic, and it's very, very deadly, but it's very organic. In fact, arsenic was used as an early pesticide, no longer used for that purposes because it's so dangerous. So don't, sometimes the conventional approach, you can do a better job and with less applications, and that's our philosophy. When it comes to tick spraying, I don't believe you should be doing more than 1 or 2 sprays. I know a lot of companies are doing it every month. I just think that there's not a good value for you. It's very bad for beneficial insects like pollinators. So minimum touch, you should be talking to whoever's your provider for those kind of services about, how often, and minimum, it should always be the goal. And the other thing I want to mention is I have a little garden blog, and I'm going to talk about 2 of the articles in here where I just kind of put local stuff. So readinggardener.com is where I have little articles. I'm working on an article right now about the White House greenhouse. I don't know if you knew that in the 1800s, right where the West Wing and the Oval Office is was actually a greenhouse where they would grow flowers for the garden. And I'm going to talk about, hopefully, if I get around to writing this, a big scandal with the Lincoln administration between the Lincolns and their gardener. And it was a huge scandal, and I don't know that most people know about it. So I'm going to try and write a little bit about that. But today, I'm here to talk about 2 things. I'm the bearer of bad news. Bye-bye boxwoods and kiss your ash goodbye. We've got 2, there's all sorts of invasive pathogens coming in all the time, but these 2 are really having an impact on our community in the last 2 years, and it's really kind of sad to see. So first I'm going to go through the boxwood problem. So boxwoods, beautiful plants, really wonderful. They work really well around here. Wonderful for formal gardens. They're just great. You can let them grow in a natural setting. You can kind of really go wild with intricate designs and things, keeping them trimmed really neatly. They're wonderful plants to work with. They're really good for this climate and this part of the country. But what's happened is in the last 30 years they've been overplanted, and it's because of the deer. The boxwoods are very desirable because they're one of the few things that the deer will not eat. Boxwoods, Andromeda, dwarf Alberta spruce, and all of those have been overplanted. And I really hate going to a landscape where I see those three things and that's it, because you've taken away all of the wonderful color palettes of azaleas and rhododendrons, and you've really created a monoculture of just boxwoods everywhere. And it's become, like I said, a monoculture. So you get rid of one problem, the deer, and you invite in 7 or 8 or 9 other problems. And now I just see boxwood problems no matter where I go in Fairfield County. So I'm going to talk about a few of the ones that I see all the time. But you know, again, that's a wonderful look. That's beautiful, but it's all the same. And I like to do things, you know, you have a wide variety, and I really encourage you to plant things. And especially now, I encourage you not to plant any boxwoods until they figure out what's going on with some of the problems we're going to talk about. So the first one, I'm going to just go through a couple of the insect and disease problems. The first one is boxwood psyllid, which I see everywhere. Boxwood psyllid is an insect that causes the cupping on the leaves that you see all over the place now. It's a little tiny insect that as the leaves come out, it causes that deformity in the leaf, and this is what he looks like. It's a really, really small insect. You really don't see the insect, you see the damage that they do, but very easy to control with a horticultural oil spray in the early spring, right as the leaves are getting ready to come out for the new growth. The horticultural oil is non-toxic. It works by basically drowning. Instead of poisoning the insect, it gets into their breathing apparatus and smothers them. Dormant oils, I advocate all the time. It's a great early spring, kind of like a spring cleaning for your plants. It takes care of not only psyllid, but mites, adelgid on hemlocks, scale on hemlocks, which is a big issue, scale on other plants, holly and rhododendrons, lacebug, which is another one of those plant problems that is on the rise because of the Andromeda. Everybody's planting Andromeda because the deer don't like it. Now, lacebug is all over the place. So doing a little bit of early season kind of spring cleaning can allow you to not have to use stronger chemicals later in the season. So I'm a big advocate of doing dormant oil sprays, and it's something you can do yourself. You can just a little 1 or 2% oil in the early spring. Right around now is when you want to do it. And that's, you just kind of soak the plant with it, and it's a great way of preventing a wide variety of problems.
Excuse me, what kind of oil?
Well, horticultural oil, there's lots of different types of horticultural oil that you can buy. Basically, it's a very highly refined oil. In the old days, a lot of the dormant oils were really heavy, and you had to worry about burning, but they've refined them down so much now that you really can't go wrong. And basically, you get, it's water and about a 1 or 2% of this horticultural oil. If you buy it, you can always read the directions on any label of any pesticides that you're buying. But it's a pretty easy thing to do. Again, it's not toxic, so you don't have to worry about the safety issue of it, and it's a great way to start the season for your plants. Just sure.
What did you say about the bees, that it doesn't stop them from, or they haven't started yet?
Bees.
The bee-
Well.
It doesn't hurt the bees.
Well, dormant oil would not hurt bees. It doesn't work on a toxic level, so it's only killing small insects by smothering them as opposed to poisoning. So that's why dormant oil or horticultural soap is another way of going kind of a non-toxic route for controlling insects. But you need to do it early in the season when they're small. For instance, scale insect will go into a crawler stage right around now. Once a scale kind of attaches itself to the plant material. And once that happens, the oils aren't going to work. You really need to get it now in the early spring when they're in the crawler stage, when the insects, whether it's the psyllid or anything, is small. That's the time to get it, and that's why you do a dormant oil spray right at the end of the dormant season before you go into spring. So the other insect problem that I see everywhere, and this has really become a major problem, is boxwood leaf miner. And you can see there's kind of a yellowish look to this boxwood, and if we take a closer look at the leaves, you'll see these blisters. This is the top of the leaf here, and you see these orange blisters, and on the bottom you see these bulges with kind of these orange, again, blisters or pockets developing. And what that is an insect called a leaf miner, which in its larvae stage lives inside the leaf. And there's lots of different types of leaf miner, but this one particularly goes after boxwoods. And if you listen, if you see it looking like this, and you go up to your boxwood and you put your ear right up to it, it sounds like Rice Krispies as they eat through the plant. And they're really kind of gross, and here's what they look like. On the inside, if you tear open that leaf, you'll see these little orange worms crawling around in there, eating their way through. So again, this is the time to treat it. Now, a dormant oil wouldn't help with that, and in fact, even a regular insecticide that goes over the top would not get into the leaf. You really needed to use a systemic insecticide to get inside the plant and get these before they turn into adults. The adult looks like a little mosquito, and right around Mother's Day, they come out and they start bobbing up and down on the boxwoods, laying their eggs. And that's exactly what they look like, little mosquitoes just kind of floating around. So they lay their eggs around Mother's Day. They sit dormant, and then in the fall, sometimes you can see the larvae starting to develop. They hatch, and then they lay dormant, and now is the time that they're doing that kind of damage and looking like the larvae. So now is when you want to look to see if you have that blistering, because you want to treat it now before they become adults and start laying more eggs. Okay, so other things that you see with boxwood all the time. Now, this looks like a disease. A lot of diseases of boxwoods look like this, but in this case, this is not a disease, it's winter burn. Winter burn is a very common problem for a lot of different types of broadleaf evergreens, and boxwoods are susceptible to it in particular. Winter burn happens when you have a plant that is exposed to sunlight and starts transpiring out of the stomata of the leaf, and there's no moisture coming up from the bottom, usually in the winter because the ground is frozen. So there's no moisture available to come up, and so the plant transpires out the moisture, there's no moisture to replace it, and the foliage burns. So often you'll see this on the southern face, where you get a hot day in the middle of the winter and it burns. The other thing that you see often is if a plant is protected all during the growing season under a deciduous tree, the deciduous tree loses its leaves. All of a sudden, it's getting direct sunlight that it's not used to. And it's just like us, and especially me, going out on the early spring and exposed to the sun, I get a sunburn. Well, they're getting kind of a sunburn as well. The other thing that can cause it is wind. Wind going by can cause the plant to transpire. If it's up against a house, the reflected heat or wind off the house can cause burning on the foliage. And so it looks like a disease, but it's not, and it's usually pretty treatable. Just a little TLC, maybe a little plant tone fertilizer to help it come back. You can see on this one, you can kind of see where the snow level was. It got up to the snow was probably this high, and everything that was above got burnt by the sun. And here, this is not truly winter burn, but this is probably salt damage off the walkway where it caused burning. But anything that caused salt will cause the plant to burn, kind of transpire out and cause that burning look. So things to look for, but it's not as bad as some of the diseases we're going to talk about, like this one, Voltula blight. Boxwoods, everywhere I go, are starting to turn kind of this brown look, and you'll see either the whole thing or a section just kind of turn brown. And most likely that's from a disease called Voltula blight. And it could cause, the plant to look kind of thin or start to lose some leaves. And you get this brownish kind of look with the kind of black dots on the bottom. That's a fungus infection. And what's interesting about this particular fungus is it also goes after a Pachysandra. So when you see boxwoods planted in and around Pachysandra, you've kind of got a perfect environment for this pathogen to really live and thrive. So the Voltula blight on the Pachysandra causes those brown circles. You kind of see a dark ring around a brown, a dark margin around the brown ring, and then it causes these big patches to die out in the Pachysandra. So what we saw in not last year, but the 2 years before that, we had a really bad drought throughout all of Fairfield County. It was really stressful on a lot of different types of plants, including the Pachysandra. And what you had was a lot of people plant Pachysandra around a big giant sugar maple or oak tree. And so you had a competition between the oak tree or the sugar maple and the Pachysandra. Well, the oak tree's been there, or the sugar maple, they've been around for 100 years. They've seen droughts before. They can handle it. And they are going to take that moisture right away from the little Pachysandra. The Pachysandra doesn't stand a chance. So often you would see in the patch of Pachysandra these big patches going through, and that's where the roots were going right under the Pachysandra and stealing all that moisture away from them, and they were shriveling up, and it's stressful. So what happens when, whether it's people or plants, when you're under stress because you don't have the nutrients that you need to stay healthy, you're much more susceptible to disease. Every Pachysandra patch has a little bit of that Votella blight hanging around in it. But when you have a stressful environment, they can't ward off those pathogens. Just like a sick person is much more prone to infection when they're sick, and that's when the disease comes in and can cause these big patches. Now, the good thing about Pachysandra is it's a pretty resilient plant, and all it needs is a little TLC. You might need to rake it out, maybe a little fungicide spray when the leaves first come out, or feeding it with a little plant tone. But usually they come back. Sometimes you need to mow down the Pachysandra, get rid of all of those dead leaves, and let it come back. And usually it comes back just fine. And it's very distressing. People were calling me, oh, my Pachysandra's dying, and it just generally, they usually come back just fine. But it spreads. Now, last year we had a lot of wetness. And so you had a lot of these spores that had built up in the Pachysandra, and then they were moving to the boxwood. And what fungus diseases need are they need wetness, they need the host plant, so in this case the boxwood, they need the pathogens coming from the Pachysandra, and they need wetness. So what I really encourage, if you have irrigation systems, that you don't allow those sprinklers to keep that plant material, anything that's susceptible to a fungus disease problem, don't have that sprinkler constantly keeping that plant wet, because that's going to increase the chances that they get the disease. And this one, the Votella blight is treatable, but this one, the new one, this boxwood blight, is deadly. And it comes from Europe. It's not been a pathogen that's, it's not in our environment naturally. But it is really bad, and it came from Europe, got into the growers down in South Carolina, and I was, like 5-6 years ago, I was hearing stories of these growers that had to burn acres of their crops. Their boxwoods were all infected and dying, and they just had to burn them. There was no treatment, and there's still no treatment. So if you get this, there's really nothing that can be done other than ripping out all of your all of your boxwoods. And I usually like to tell people, oh, here's a treatment, and it's kind of like the doctor, take 2 pills and call me in the morning. Well, there's no cure for this disease, and it can be really devastating. It can just wipe out and go right through your boxwood, and really here you got Pachysandra, you got boxwoods. And what was happening last year is I was getting a lot of calls. I had gotten calls over the years. Somebody had just planted a bunch of Pachysandra, and later that summer they all started to die. But you never heard about it just kind of popping up. But last summer was different. We had a really wet summer, a lot of pathogens out there, and because things were wet, they were able to take hold. And all of a sudden, people who hadn't just recently purchased a boxwood and brought it in from a nursery, but maybe their neighbor did. And maybe they share a lawn mowing company with their neighbor. And these spores on this particular disease are very sticky, and they get there through contact. So whether it's on the clothes of the guy coming to trim, or doing other types of work on your yard, or the lawnmower, the sticky spores getting on that lawnmower and then shooting out onto yours. That's how all of a sudden last year it started getting around. And now that it's out there, I don't know that it's ever going to go away. And it may just be devastating to boxwoods. The way to prevent, there are some varieties of boxwoods that are resistant, but I don't know that there's any that are 100% resistant. So be careful when you buy boxwoods. And my advice is don't buy any boxwoods and plant them until they figure out what's going on here. Here's some more pictures. It's just devastating. Now, there are treatments that you can do to prevent the infection, but it's usually multiple sprays of fungicides like chlorothalonil, which gets very expensive, and I'm not recommending my customers, unless they really, really were desperate to try and prevent it, I usually am not recommending those kind of treatments. There was a story that I heard at a lecture of a company, this person they had a lot of boxwoods. They spent like $5,000 in a year to prevent the disease, and they still got the infection. So I'm just not telling people to do that. So hopefully, and one way to look, we've sent in a lot of samples. Some would come back positive for the boxwood blight. Some would come back for positive for the Vitello blight. Some would come back positive for both. And a lot of it was because it was so rainy. But you see kind of the leaves curl up and you get very spindly. Not all of them. Sometimes they'll defoliate right down. And you get these dark streaks on the stems. That's one way to differentiate it between Vitello blight, which is usually more kind of a brown look to the stems. But really the only way to know for sure is to send samples into the Connecticut Experiment Station, get them tested under the lab, and find out what exactly your disease is. And if it comes back boxwood blight, then you just basically have to rip everything out. And then the other major thing that's come into our area and is impacting our open space and our street trees is this emerald ash borer. And as tree warden in town, I had been posting ash trees for years. The ash trees are beautiful, wonderful. They get to be these massive trees. I had one in my yard that we lost, not to emerald ash borer, but to ash yellows, which is another disease that's going around. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But they're massive trees, they're great. The tree that I lost, finally had to cut down, was 125 years old. It wasn't quite as big as this, but it was a big one. And they're great wood for baseball bats, and because it's strong wood, but it's lightweight, and it's really good for firewood. It's the best firewood. In fact, there's the firewood poem about that lady Cecilia Congreve wrote many years ago. It's a very famous poem, and the tagline at each of the stanza, it goes through all the different types of firewood, oaks and maple and everything, but the stanza is, ashwood wet or ashwood dry, a king shall warm his slippers by. It really is the best firewood that is out there, and a lot of it is becoming firewood now as we cut all these trees down. So ash yellows causes this kind of gradual dieback in the canopy, and that's what we were seeing for many, many years in Reading, having to post street trees, ash trees, as they were dying from this disease. By then, 2 summers ago, this emerald ash borer, which had been wreaking havoc throughout the Midwest, finally showed up in Reading and is now just tearing through all of the ash trees, whether they're on open space or in people's yards or along the streets. And we are removing, the town is having to remove so many trees this year. It's really overwhelming. I used to post 75 trees in a year. I posted 75 trees on one stretch of road on Sunset Hill. I'd never seen that many trees have to come down, and it just keeps going on and on and on. It's very hard to keep up with. So this is what the adult of the emerald ash borer looks like. It's a beautiful insect, but it is a deadly insect. It's very small. I've actually never seen the adult one in the wild. I've only seen pictures or specimens. Causes these holes where they exit from, and the one that the life stage that does the damage is, again, the larvae that lives inside the cambium and kind of crawls its way through. And what we're seeing now is the woodpeckers are going after the trees, and as you drive down the road, you'll see these ash trees. Instead of gray barks, they have, it's called blonding, where the trees have been stripped of the bark as the woodpeckers are trying to get to the larvae inside. And sometimes they're leaving these big piles of shrapnel from the bark of the tree all around the bottom. And it's once it gets to that point, it's really over for the ash tree, and it becomes very unstable very quickly because they've chewed out the cambium, and the tree is much more susceptible to coming down, and that's why we have to get these down along the roadways. And if you have an ash tree near your house or your car park or just in your yard, you probably want to think about getting it taken down before it falls down. So the other thing I just noticed, and I just kind of threw this in at the end here, is has anybody seen chipmunks yet this year?
Yes.
Have you seen a lot or a few? I haven't. I've seen a lot the last 2 or 3 years, but I haven't seen very many at all. I've heard people say got some. Maybe it's early, but I'm thinking that maybe the mice and the chipmunks didn't make it through the winter well. And it wasn't cold, but one thing that happened last fall was we didn't have a lot of acorns. And so we're seeing, my guess is that they may not have had the food supply they needed to get through their hibernation time. And the other thing that we're seeing now in the spring is a tremendous amount of deer damage because the deer use the acorns as well to load up, carbo load, to build up the fat reserves to get through the winter. When they don't have it, they do a tremendous amount of damage to whether it's arborvitaes or rhododendrons like that. I'm seeing, especially down in Westport, the deer are just going crazy down there. So, that's kind of the circle of life. If you need the diseases need the water in order to complete their life cycle. The chipmunks need the acorns in order to complete theirs. So it's all interconnected. We all need the pollinators. These are all important things to be aware of and to be sensitive when we're doing things in the yard, whether it's planting another boxwood or doing a tick spray. We want to be sensitive that we're not disrupting kind of the natural cycles that are going out there and they're going to change. Some years you don't have a lot of acorns. And that's, that's part of what makes chipmunks and mice stronger. The stronger ones survive, they go on. That's kind of how nature works. But we don't want to be disrupting too much those natural cycles with the activity that man does. We want to be sensitive to it all the time.
You mentioned chipmunks. What about squirrels?
A lot of squirrels around. Yeah, I think they're a bigger animal. They're probably easier to survive. But yeah, no, they're going, and they survive by my bird feeder is what they're doing. Yeah.
The rhododendrons, when the leaves are just hanging and is that winter?
Yeah, so I'm getting a lot of calls about rhododendrons looking very sick this spring, and I'm hoping it's that. It could be something very serious, phytophthora disease, which kills the root system. I'm hoping it's not that, but we had a very wet year last year, and I'm really hopeful that I would give it some time, see if it comes back. If portions of the bush don't come back, trim those off. Yeah, I'm seeing that. I'm getting calls about it, and I've seen it. I'm hoping that maybe, rhododendrons will, as a defense mechanism, kind of curl their leaves for the winter, and maybe they're just slow coming out of it. That's what I'm hoping. Yep.
I have a lot of Leucosa-weed, and it was looking okay, and now all of a sudden the tops roll around.
Brown, winter
I
burn.
think that's just winter.
Should be fine. Little,
Should I prune it down,
you can prune it down and a little holly-tone fertilizer.
like you said to do for the...
Same thing with the boxwood. Just prune out the dead. Just give it a little time. If it still looks that way, prune it out. All right, and I want to turn it over to John McLaren now to talk about.
Oh, I appreciate that. I have good news, bad news. The bad news is I report to Sean as part of my position, so I had to wear a tie. The good news is they're forget-me-nots if you can't see them, so. Bear with me for a moment. You got all sorts of things I'd like to spread out here. What I'm proposing is that I'm going to put out a lot of specific information that you can look at your leisure when this is done. The point of this is to indicate to you that indeed we know a great deal about our open space here in the town of Reading. Each one of these maps is like an overlay and represents different types of information, whether it's geological, historic, archaeological, topographic, or whatever. And these are just some of the maps that we have access to that the town has printed over the years. Also have other maps that I'm putting out, which we'll talk about, which is what do we know about our open space, what's in there. And this represents a series of surveys which are current going on. But we're short of time, so all I'm going to do is kind of give you an overview of what goes on in our open space and how we, the town, does it. My name is John McLaren. I lived in Reading for 44 years. Over the years, I've walked most of the open spaces, have spent most of my life as what we might call an amateur scientist, biologist, ecologist. I have run 2 environmental education centers, one called the Woodcock Nature Center for 10 years and one called the Pratt Nature Center up in New Milford. So I have a lot of background in terms of working with young children in education, but I'm an amateur, I guess you call environmentalist, and I've done studies of insects, specifically dragonflies. My studies are in the Museum of Natural History and also the Yukon collections of insects up in stores. Where to start? Well, I guess the best place to start is, Ruth asked me, talk a little bit about what we have as open space. And the first thing we have to define is what is open space. And it gets tricky, so there are legal definitions. I'm going to use what is the most general one, which is in effect undeveloped natural space. Whether it's in Reading or it's in Wyoming, it's what nature gave us that's on the land that's been undeveloped or unimproved. This is a map that was put out when we updid all of our long-term planning in 2008, and it's hard to see, but you'll see more of it when you come up. The green spaces, which I think you can see, represent what we would call open space. The yellow spaces are, in effect, that which is housing in town. And as I say, it'll make a lot more sense when you look at it from close up. Our development of our open space dates back essentially to 1965. And at that point, a number of very concerned citizens started to speak up. And we acquired our first open space. Well, in 1965, what do we have in open space as a town? We had 1.3 acres. And it's the town green. And it wasn't really open space because it was totally improved and cut into grass. But I'm going to quote for a minute from the report which was done. It's part of the supplement. It's a supplement to the Town of Reading Plan for Conservation and Development, and it dates from 2008. The new one is in process. I wish I had the new one. It's about to go to press, but it's not quite completed. But I think essentially it says two things which I think we can all take meaning from as to how did we get to where we are now with 37% of our land protected as open space? And the answer is it had to do with a handful of very concerned citizens in our town in the mid-60s, and many people that have stepped up since then. But I'm going to read from the open space plan, which says, this is the introduction, and it says, the guiding principle of this plan, as set forth in the 1971 open space plan and carried through subsequent plans as follows. I quote, not the upgrading of subdivisions, not commercial areas, not industry, nor multiple housing, but open space is the key to the future of Reading as a valuable and viable community. Fairfield County has strenuous cities and active suburbs, but it also needs wide areas of open country to balance the environment. Due to its rugged topography, Reading is admirably designed by nature for this function. And that's how we started. That's how they put it. And that kicked off what became a long series of acquisitions. Many of the open spaces that we have were acquired through state and federal monies, and with those came many restrictions. Many of our open spaces, those of us that lived in town might remember that at one time we wanted to take Couch Hill and turn it into soccer. And I think, Amy, can you remember, was it soccer fields or playing fields? Same thing with Saugatuck Falls, right across from the middle school. And that the way it's worded by accepting the grants from the federal government and the state is that there are restrictions that come with those lands, and essentially they can be used only for passive recreation, which by itself would take another definition. Then you might say, well, how did my job come into position and why did we have that? And that occurs on page 6 of the same plan. And under what's called land management, it says the commission believes that the town of Reading and Land Trust, which together own over 2,800 acres, and this was again written in 2008, of open land, should consider the hiring of a part-time part-time land manager. There are too many activities that would occur under the Reading Land Trust and the Conservation Commission that they couldn't handle. So They opened up the position in 2011, and in my innocence, I applied and have served as the open space manager since then. And you say, well, what do we know about our open space? What have we learned? Well, the first thing I did for the Conservation Commission was to look at all the open spaces that we do own, the biggest, which would be Saugatuck Falls natural area. That's 318 acres, down to what is the smallest of our bigger open spaces, which is the Fred Hansen Preserve, which is 30 acres. And I went in and did a survey and wrote up a report on each one, which is now filed at the Old Town Hall. And then I proceeded, after that, to go through the other 112 smaller parcels, identify them, visit them, write up a report as to what exists on those open spaces. And that's all on file. I've also recorded and set up a database for the easements that the town owns. That was already done for the Reading Land Trust, so I didn't need to do that. But to give you a sense of what we own collectively between the Reading Land Trust and the town of Reading, the town has approximately 110 parcels that they own and has, I think, 18 what we call easements. The Reading Land Trust has approximately 110 fee-owned properties and I think now 61 easements. What I do for the Reading Land Trust is I have to visit each one of those every year and walk around them and talk about what's in them. So it's a very busy position, and but very rewarding. So the question is, so what do we know about our open spaces? What is in there? And one of the great luxuries that our town has is that we have an organization called HISTED. It used to be called HISTED Arboretum. And it's just down the street from where we're sitting, and it has a handful of very highly trained individuals, ecologists, who specialize essentially in looking at forests. And they not only work on our behalf here in Reading, but they also work on the behalf of land trusts and conservation organizations all over New England. I consider one of the important aspects of my position is collaborating and coordinating what the Land Trust does, the Conservation Commission does, and what we can avail ourselves of the benefit of HISTED. And to that end, Ed Faison, who is the senior conservation ecologist there, started something in Reading long before I had my job, which was plot monitoring on town-owned open spaces. He took 60, he has a much more sophisticated background than I do, but he has set up 28 plots in town-owned open spaces that are 60 meters square. That's a little bit bigger than this room. And every 5 years, 1 or 2 botanists with a master's in botany will go in and they will inventory every sedge, every reed, every wildflower, every vine, every tree, everything that's in there that's alive, that's growing. And they will inventory it and put it into a database. So we probably know more than any other town in the state of Connecticut and perhaps New England about what's growing in our open space. It doesn't represent every part of the land that we have, but it is a sample representation. And so when I can ask Ed, for instance, I will ask him, can I have a pie chart for the percentage composition of the 16 plots by species group? And there it is. And so you can come up and look at this. It's way too detailed to talk about specifically, but I can do the same thing with wildflowers. I can talk about the diameter of the trees. I can talk about the herbaceous plant relative abundance in Reading, and there's the pie chart. You might ask, well, what's the most common of the wildflowers that's out there? And it turns out it's actually Canada Mayflower. And the second most common is actually a sedge called Pennsylvanica, what is the Latin name for sedge? I'm just drawing a blank. Anyway, that's the second most common, and it's actually a sedge. And you will see it if you walk through the woods in any of our town-owned open spaces, and you probably have it on your own property. You see it as a grass, but it's a sedge. And as a matter of fact, until Ed, many years ago, very politely corrected me, I referred to it as a grass. So what's out there is always very much a learning process. So we know a lot about what's out there. And so what do we do? Also, what can we do to have people become more knowledgeable? And I periodically do programs. I've done programs with the 6th and 7th grades in the middle school, taken them across the street and done programs that involve trees and birds and wildflowers across the street in Saugatuck Falls. I also do programs at New Pond Farm for the inner city children that come to the summer camp. I do a dragonfly program for them. And I will be doing a program about our native frogs this Saturday at Topstone Park, if anybody wants to know what we have in frogs. And we're very lucky because we have a lot of information that is available to us. For instance, if you said, well, what do we know about frogs in Connecticut? Or what do we know about frogs in Reading? A gentleman by the name of Clemens wrote a book for the DEP many years ago. It's Clemens with a K, and just coincidentally. And so what he did, he's one of the leading authorities on frogs and amphibians in all of the United States. I think he lives in Cornwall, Kent or Cornwall. I've never met him, but almost did when I was up in New Milford. And his book is so detailed that you can look up any town in the state of Connecticut and it will list what historically has been found in his database, either the frog or, in this case, I'm not working with salamanders Saturday, but salamanders are in there too. But he has frogs and toads by town. So you can look up, in our case, we have 6 frogs and 1 toad. And so there's a lot of information that we have accessible to us. We know a lot about what we have in terms of our open space. I'm going to stop there. No, you might say, well, what do you do to increase your knowledge of what it is that we know about our town? And I go periodically to different workshops, either put on by the DEP. 2 weeks ago, I was at a workshop, the Connecticut Land Conference, the CLCC conference at Wesleyan. It's a one-day workshop. And there are about 60 different workshops that you can take depending on what you do that relate to land conservation. And it's a wonderful opportunity to meet other individuals, like-minded individuals. And it's a very empowering feeling to sit in a room with 550 individuals that are concerned with and are engaged in land management. Our state senator, Mr. Blumenthal, was there. And he said, I could use some of you people in Washington, but we'll save that for another meeting. I'll stop. There's a lot to talk about, but I'd be more than happy to answer questions. I'm just skimming the surface of what goes on. So, Ruth.
Do other towns have positions like you are in?
Very few. I know of only 2 in the state. There are probably others. I know of one in Fairfield, I think it is. Gentleman, when he was starting his job, he came. I'd only had my job for a year, but he came over and we talked, and I helped him kind of write a job description that would his job. They only have that town. It isn't Fairfield. Maybe I have to look it up. It's over by Fairfield. They only have 1 large open space, but they have a lot of problems. Fortunately, we don't have to deal with a lot. They have a lot of dumping. They have a lot of ATV riding. We have some of that. We have some dumping. So his issue is how to best administer the oversight of this 1 large open space. I think it's about 800 acres, whereas ours is divided up into a lot more smaller open spaces. And you might ask, what problems do we have? The good news is we don't have a lot of problems. We do have dumping. We have people that will mow from their property into either Reading Land Trust or town open space. We have people that will build sometimes a fence onto town-owned open space. So then we have to send a letter to them, and sometimes we have to sick Amy on them. But I'll stop, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. Marion, yes? Carex, that's right, sedge, thank you. One thing I've tried very hard not to do is learn Latin names. But somebody once said, what do you know about wildflowers? And out of curiosity, this is just how my mind works, for 3 years, from 1989 to 1991, my wife and I live on the west side of Reading over on Mountain Road. For 3 years, I kept a log of every wildflower species and shrub that I found within 8 feet of each side of the road for 1 mile from where I live up to where 70 Acre and Mountain Road intersect. And I put it in a database, and there are 126 wildflowers that I found within 8 feet of the side of the road. This is my printout of what it is. It's probably a lot more because I'm not an expert when it gets into goldenrods and you get into asters. I know there are at least, I couldn't tell you how many different goldenrods I see on the side of the road, but I put them just down as one goldenrod, so that might be 5 or 6 additional species. Asters, same thing. Violets, same thing. I don't have the knowledge of the field guides to identify them down to the species, so it could be a lot more. I'd mentioned this to Ruth the other day, and she said, well, what do you think is out there now? I have not gone back to look, but I would guess if I did the same thing over a 3-year period, I would guess there are probably less than 30 of those 120 wildflowers, mostly because of invasive species, primarily on our road, something called black swallowwort, which has really taken over a lot of the road. But that's available as a database. So, any other questions?
Well, I have one more question.
Yes.
You are a one-man band in terms of managing and the steward of these open spaces, right?
I
You
have,
other people.
well, Amy helps me, she and I collaborate. I have the expertise of all the people on the Conservation Commission. I work a lot with Bill Hill. I'm, for instance, because of my background, I've written grants. I'm about to start writing a grant to help remediate some of the invasives that are creeping into Couch Hill, which is over by Huntington Park. And one of the things they're trying to do is to improve not only and remove a series of invasives, but we're trying to improve the soil quality because it's one of, I believe, 6 nesting spaces of a bird called a bobolink in the whole state of Connecticut. And because of what's creeping into the fields, and because the fields need feeding to keep the condition of the hay that's in there of a good enough quality to be harvested and to keep the birds coming back, I'm going to write a grant. In this case, it's a state grant, and it's a nice grant because it's a 9-to-1 grant match. Most grants, I don't understand this. If you're a commercial venue, as we are, the town of Reading, it's a 9-to-1 grant match. But if you're the Reading Land Trust and you don't have any money and you're poor, it's a 50-50 match. So go figure. I tried to ask these people, they said, we don't understand why it was set up that way either. But if we spend $10,000 to improve the soil quality and open up the first 2 fields, it'll cost the town $1,000, and that's a good deal. So there are a lot of things that we are doing. The overall thinking currently by most ecologists is open space, despite the fact of all the invasion of all the invasive species. There's not a lot that can be done, even if you have a lot of money, because once something like Asian bittersweet or barberry establishes itself, you can dig it up, you can burn it, you can poison it with herbicides, but it will be back within 2 or 3 years because it likes where it is, and the birds will just, you might, it's at a level where a community such as Reading has no capacity to deal with it. So it's here forever, and the only thing we can hope is sometimes we're able to develop something that will biologically that would either reduce it or erase it. Sean didn't have time, but I attended a workshop with the DEP last spring, and one of the things that they're working on is they have 2 Asian insects. I think they're wasps. They're tiny, and they're breeding them, and they're releasing them on a test basis to attack the emerald ash borer. And it's very likely that they will, we're hoping they will actually be able to release some in Reading. And the first results are quite effective, but by the time they can get enough of them released in the next 3 to 5 years, our emerald ash trees, our white ash trees will be decimated. They'll be gone. So unfortunately, that will not be in time. What we hope is that some of the smaller ashes will survive, and some of the larger ones will be protected. Incidentally, I don't know if Sean mentioned this, but if you have a large specimen ash, you can protect it and spray it, but you have to do it every year. The spray is very effective, but it's expensive. So, so there's that too. But isn't it wonderful that we can live in a town where we have, relatively speaking, a lot of open space. And it's beautiful open space, and that we know a lot about it, and we have a wonderful respect for it. I know it's one of the things that made me move to where I am. I actually grew up in Katona, the other side of Richfield, and incidentally, I was telling Susan Green a couple of weeks ago, I had an aunt who lived a mile down the road. I didn't know this. She was really a wonderful gardener. And she used to call up on Saturday morning and she'd say to my father, "Could Johnny come over and help me today?" I was never asked, but I went. And I just thought, you know, people have these nice looking gardens. Well, she's in this book called American Border Gardens. She had beautiful gardens. It's now part of a nature center. She donated her 120 acres to a Bedford Audubon Society, and so it's a nature center. They tried to get me to go to run it, and I said, not me. but she's in the book, and it's beautiful gardens. You come up, take a look. So turns out I know more about gardens than I thought I did. And so I have wonderful, both my mother and my aunt were very active in their respective garden clubs in their day. And so I never thought about it as knowing more than I thought I did. The bad news is I've forgotten most of it. But some people say, well, how do you ever get involved in wanting to be fascinated by nature? In my case, my father loved opera. True story. Wagner was his favorite. Sunday afternoon, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the radio would go on for 4 hours. I grabbed my coat, I went out to the woods, and that's what got me going. But amazingly enough, and this is how life works in strange ways. A man moved in when I was 7 years old. This is on a dairy farm in Katona. When I was 7 years old, a man moved in. His name was Stanley Grierson. Turned out he was probably one of a half a dozen people that were teaching environmental education at the elementary school level in the 1940s. Wow. And I had the luxury of going over to his property and following him around. By the time I was 12, I could tell you any bird that flew through by hearing it. I can't do that anymore. I've lost that. But at 12, I could do that. So it is funny what. So I personally feel very strongly that we all collectively tend to think if we're going to impress and move people to be more environmentally conscious, I have no problem with working with adults. But my impression is if the way that you're going to reach the world is through the youth of the world. It takes longer, but it's more effective. That's my personal opinion.
Well,
Ruth.
that was my point. You know, you are this valuable resource that Reading has, but are there interns or are there summer high school students or something?
They're not, but now that I know more about what I'm doing, and I found out how to tie this tie, that I would like very much to, for instance, I found out by accident there were 3 students from Joe Barlow who came to the CLCC conference 2 weeks ago. I don't know why they came, but they came for a reason. And I'm going to contact the science department, and I'm going to see if there couldn't be an interaction. Now, Highstead has interns all the time. And I've had the pleasure of working with many of them. As a matter of fact, one of the maps here with one of their interns 3 years ago, Mary Buchanan, her specialty was GIS mapping. And I had the pleasure of working with her to take one of these maps and update it. One of the things we don't talk about much is we know we have Town of Reading, about 2,000 acres, Reading Land Trust, about 2,000 acres, but we have Highstead, we have the DNKL, the Buddhist monasteries, 110 acres. That has an easement on it that I have to walk around all their property every year. It's 110 acres. Incidentally, does everybody know what an easement is as opposed to fee-owned property? Fee-owned means you own it outright. You bought it, you paid for it, or it was given to you. An easement is is you all own property, and you decide, I love some trees on my property, and you set up an easement restriction, and you write in this restriction into your deed that says, I want to protect these 26 trees on my property, and I give the right to the Reading Land Trust or the Nature Conservancy or Connecticut Audubon the right to enforce this restriction. And that deed travels with that property forever. So whatever you write into the easement restriction travels with that property after you've sold the property. It's our job to be stewards, in my case, the Reading Land Trust, to be stewards to enforce that easement to the best of my ability. So that what's important is by having an easement, you don't have to pay to own it, but you still have certain rights that, meaning, in effect, if it's a good restriction or easement, it's just as good as owning it because nobody can change what it is that's already there. There are many different kinds of easements. Could be a development easement. You don't want someone to build a house on your property. But most of them are what we call conservation easements, and they have to do with protecting what's on the land. And they can be very specific. The DNKL easement is, I think, 38 pages of information. All I can think of is, boy, did that lawyer get rich when they wrote that easement. But, yes?
Could you mention the role of what they call, the trail tenders,
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Reading has, to Stuart Green, and I see Ken, and many others, and your husband, Mr. Wright, and I don't know the names of everybody, is they do a wonderful job as volunteers, day in and day out, to keep open all the 66 miles of trails that the town has. I don't run into them very often, and they don't know who I am. So I come to the annual meeting. One of the biggest mistakes I ever made is when we have this meeting, which is the 27th, I think, of April. We have an annual meeting, we all come together and we introduce ourselves as to who we are and what we do. I didn't realize Julia Pemberton was standing right behind me. When they got to me, they said, my name is John McLaren, I'm the open space manager. I'm the only person in town that gets paid to hide in the woods. Incidentally, Julia emailed me about 6 years ago when I was kind of starting out. The email, I knew who she was. I'd said hello to her, but I didn't know her. And she said, when I go hiking, I get lost. Can I go hiking with you? And I emailed her back, and I said, by all means, I'd be delighted. But I said, I have a little secret. I get lost sometimes, too. And we did. I took her to, I think, 6 or 7 of the larger of the open spaces. And she was a wonderful opportunity for her to learn more about what we have. And I encourage every one of you, there are precious few towns that have as much open space and as varied open space and as many trails to access it as we do. So most of what you can access, the trails are pretty easy to hike on. And I know you all know that we have our book of trails, which I just learned yesterday at the annual meeting for the Reading Land Trust, that we're now giving the books away to anybody who might like them. And I have, if anybody here would like one, I have them in my car. And there's a little secret. I'll just tell you here in this room, if you promise not to tell everybody else in town, is that I have been giving out the books for a number of years to young people who have moved to town and said that if you like the book, you can make a donation to the Reading Land Trust. And it's worked out very well. So anyway, so I'm sorry, run over time, but yes?
You can also download all the trails on your computer.
Yeah, yes, you can. Well, I'm not sure all of them, but most of them, yeah. One of the things I attended at the land conference, I attended a workshop on what's called story maps. And the idea is that you look at a map on your computer, and let's say there's a little dot that's the trailhead. So you click on the dot, and it opens up a whole story. It could be a verbal story, it could be a written story, and it can connect to photographs. So let's say you're walking across the street into Saugatuck Falls, and if you have your smartphone and you click on this one spot at Saugatuck Falls, and all of a sudden it gives you all the sounds of all the birds that you can hear in Saugatuck Falls. So anything that's information is considered a layer that can be added to a map and turn it into a story. So that's to come, and I don't know if anybody's, Stuart is working on this, I'm not sure. He and I haven't talked, but I see that as something that's in our future in mapping. He has. I don't know if he's done stories, but he's done mapping. Yep. So.
Thank you, John. And soon to update us, to keep us alive and well, and what we have is our wonderful resource here in town. So.
Come on up and take a peek at.
Oh, no.